Welcome back. Today, I'm doing an explanation of the movie, Hotel Rwanda, from 2004. Spoilers ahead. Watch out. Hey YouTubing fam, please, like and share the content, and don't forget to smash that subscribe button and press the notification icon so you can catch new videos. Paul is the protagonist of the film. Paul is a hotel manager, and he goes to the airport to receive 2 packages of cigars freshly delivered from Havana, Cuba. On his way back to the hotel, a staff of his, Dubé, compliments the cigar, stating that it's a specially made cigar. Paul states the origin and tells him each is worth over 10,000 francs. Dubé is shocked, but Paul comments that it's worth more than the price to him. He explained that, if he were to give a businessman 10,000 francs, it would be appreciated less than if he gives the same businessman a Cohiba cigar, straight from Havana. Paul goes to meet George giving him a cigar, and George also compliments that the Cohiba is a fantastic cigar.
Fantastic cigar.
George asks if Paul would join them at the rally later today. Paul says that he has other things which take up his time, and he doesn't have time for politics or rallies. George tells him that politics is power, and he needs to join his people. Paul goes on to order the items he wanted from George along with 6 extra cases of beer. George in turn comments that business must be very good. He says he is always delighted to see Paul because of the business he brings to him. At the hotel, General Bizimungu and Colonel Oliver talk about the peace agreement, and the colonel expresses his fears about a rogue group that the general promises are under his control. Paul comes out to greet them, and he recommends to the general the fresh lobsters for lunch. To which the general replies that he makes them proud here in Kigali. Paul thanks them and takes his leave. Paul goes home to his family. He kisses his wife, Tatiana, and gives chocolate to the kids. At night, while the family relaxes in the parlor, Roger, Paul's son, comes to tell them he has seen soldiers outside. They go out and see a group of soldiers harassing one of their neighbors, Victor. Later that night, Tatiana asked her husband why they would arrest Victor, and he told her that someone had denounced him as a rebel spy. Tatiana pleaded with Paul to get a hold of one of his contacts in the army, but Paul said he could not, and that the reason he stores up favors with highly influential people was for when he or his family was in need of it. The next day, Paul receives journalists at the hotel. They were around to cover the peace summit soon to be held. One of the journalists, Jack, inquires from a local journalist what the difference was between the Hutus and Tutsis. Benedict, the local journalist, explains that according to the Belgians the Tutsis are taller and more elegant. The Belgians created the divisions by grouping with similar physical qualities. Benedict went further to explain that the Belgians used the Tutsis to run the country, but when they left power to the Hutus, and they began taking revenge on the Tutsis for years of oppression. The ceremony for the peace agreement commences. Colonel Oliver gives his speech remarking that all will come to regard this day as a great day in the history of Rwanda, and they all toast to peace. Later at night, Paul's brother-in-law comes to the hotel with his wife, and he tells Paul that his assistant, who's a Hutu, had told him they must get out of Rwanda now. Why they still can. Paul claims that the man only wants his job, and assures them to be relaxed as the UN and the world press is now in Kigali. Paul tells them that things can't escalate any further now the whole world is watching. That night, when Paul drives home, he sees a neighborhood in complete chaos with houses being burnt down, and a number of army personnel drive past him in 2 trucks heading in the opposite direction. Paul arrives at his house and no one seems to be home. He searches, and is surprised that his wife, kids and several of his neighbors were all hiding in the living room. Paul wants to know why they are all in his house. Some tell him that their houses were burnt down. Some others ask Paul if he hadn't heard the news that the president had been murdered by Tutsi rebels. He doesn't believe any of this yet and asks everyone to leave the room. They soon find out that Roger had gone missing. Paul and Tatiana go out to look for him, and they find him in a bush just outside their compound. He was covered in blood and appeared to be hurt, but soon they find out that the blood wasn't his. The next day, the sound of gunshots fills the air. On the radio, the Hutu extremist agitates over the murder of the president by the Tutsi rebels and that they must cut the tall trees now. Soldiers arrive at Paul's home and everyone is terrified. Paul boldly steps out to have a word with them. The general tells Paul they wish to use his hotel. He takes Paul along to get the keys, which are in the safe. Paul insists that it is not safe for his family at his home, and that they must come along. They follow the soldiers to the hotel. On the way, they see bodies littered the streets. The city has turned on its head. There's complete chaos and anarchy. The Tutsis were brought out to the streets and massacred in their numbers. They arrive at the hotel and Paul opens up the safe, hiding some cash in his pocket before getting the keys. He comes out and sees his family and neighbors being rounded up. He goes to the general telling him he's got the keys. The general smacks him, calling him a traitor, and that his family and neighbors are all Tutsi cockroaches. He gives Paul a gun and asks him to shoot them. Paul pleads with the general that he would give him money in exchange for their lives. He gets the money and gives it to the soldiers. The soldiers take the money and Paul returns to the hotel. The foreigners begin fleeing the country and Paul is left in charge of the hotel. He gets his family settled in one of the rooms. The hotel is overwhelmed with foreigners trying to get hold of their embassies and documents so they can flee the country. Paul wonders where Gregoire, who works at the reception, is. Dubé tells him that he has moved into the presidential suite. Paul goes there, and to his surprise, Gregoire opens the door. Paul instructs him to get back to work, but Gregoire says he doesn't have to listen to him anymore. Gregoire threatens to rat out the Tutsis hiding at the hotel if he is not left alone. Later, a medical staff, Pat, brings in several children from an orphanage and pleads with Paul to accommodate them at the hotel while she goes to get the rest of them. Before leaving, Paul makes a request to her to help him search for his brother-in-law and bring the family back to the hotel as well. Paul worries that he might lose his job after the crisis is over by bringing in his neighbors and others seeking refuge, lowering the tone of the hotel. While he talks about this, he suddenly remembered the orphans and that they hadn't been taken care of by anyone since arrival. He calls a staff to handle this. Jack, after David had interviewed the colonel, felt they needed to be covering the stories outside the walls of the hotel. David was scared and said they can't leave the hotel without an armored car. Although David was his boss, Jack ignored his rules and went on with the cameraman to cover what was going on in the streets. When the workers at the hotel were all reluctant to work, Paul gets a letter from Mr. Tillins, the owner of the hotel, appointing him as general manager. Then Paul scolds his employees for their reluctance and asks anyone who isn't ready to work to leave the hotel. Later, Paul is helping David fix a broken AC, and Jack walks in with footage of what was going on outside the hotel. David at first scolds him but is stunned to see Tutsis beaten to death and massacred. He starts making calls trying to get the footage on the news urgently. Paul later calls out Jack, and Jack apologizes to Paul for showing him the footage earlier, but Paul insisted that he was glad he shot that footage. Paul tells him it might be the only chance for the rest of the world to find out what is happening and intervene. Jack, who knows that it is unlikely anyone would intervene, tells Paul that if no one intervenes, it's still good footage to show. Paul wonders how it's possible no one will intervene after seeing such atrocities. Jack tells him he thinks people will see it and feel compassion, but would move on with their lives. The next day, the hotel is overwhelmed by Tutsis seeking refuge from the onslaught, now happening everywhere across the city. The UN soldiers, who weren't under any authority to use their weapons, guard the gates of the hotel against angry Hutus seeking the blood of every Tutsis they could find. Later, Paul and Tatiana meet with Pat. Tatiana asked Pat if she found her brother and his family, but Pat replied that their house was empty and had already been ransacked when she got there. Pat tells her that her brother's two little girls are with an old lady and they are safe. Pat sadly narrates to them how she was made to watch the killing of the remaining children at the orphanage. Pat tells Paul that the Hutus are targeting the Tutsis children as well to wipe out the next generation. Paul is still optimistic everything will get back to normal as there would be a European intervention coming soon. The European soldiers arrive and this makes everyone excited. Paul is surprised to see the colonel's reaction after talking with the soldiers. Paul offers a drink to the colonel and congratulates him, but the colonel tells him he should be spitting on his face instead of congratulating him. The colonel explains to him that the West won't intervene because everyone thinks they are dead and done and that the Europeans have no plans of staying, and are only here to evacuate their citizens. While the foreign nationals are being processed and arranged in the buses ready to be evacuated, more refugees arrive at the hotel. They are led into the hotel by a priest. The soldiers tell the priest that no Rwandans are allowed to board the buses.
No Rwandans!
The priests argue the children cannot be left behind. Paul comes and tells the priest that it's of no use to argue and that he should take his people on the bus and he would be responsible for the rest. Everyone left at the hotel watches as the buses leave. The next morning, Paul and Tatiana are woken up with a gun pointed at them. The soldiers asked if he was the manager and Paul replies yes. The lieutenant orders Paul to get everyone out of the hotel immediately. Paul offers the lieutenant and his men beer to buy a few minutes. Paul goes to the phone and tries to get a hold of General Bizimungu, but he's unable to. Then he calls Mr. Tillins. Paul tells him the Hutu army is at the hotel, and they've ordered everyone out of the hotel. Mr. Tillins asks Paul why they gave such an order, and Paul replies he thinks the army wishes to kill them all. Mr. Tillins asks how many they are at the hotel, and Paul says they are about 1,000 including the staff. This shocks Mr. Tillins, and he asks Paul for advice on who to call to stop the potential massacre. Paul suggests the French as they supply the Hutu army. Mr. Tillins tells Paul he must do everything he can to buy some time, and he would call him right back. Paul goes back to the reception and finds out the lieutenant has ordered the guest list for the hotel. Paul prepares the guest list 2 weeks ago. He gives it to the lieutenant, and after reading it, he asks Paul if he's trying to mock him as he notices there were still foreigners on the list. The lieutenant orders Paul to go back and get the names of all the cockroaches in there, threatening to kill everyone if he doesn't get those names. While Paul goes to get the names, the lieutenant receives a call. Then he calls Paul back, asking who he called, but Paul acts clueless. He asks Paul for his name, and he promises to remember Paul. The soldiers leave, and Paul is relieved. Paul asked Mr. Tillins how he was able to get the soldiers to leave, and he replied that he got through to the French president's office. Paul appreciates his support. Paul gathers everyone at the hotel telling them that there would be no intervention or rescue mission by the Europeans or Americans, and they can only save themselves. Paul advises that a lot of them know many influential people abroad and that they must call these people, and they must let these people know what is going on. He tells his employees to erase the registers and remove all the numbers from the hotel doors. The air spanning through the atmosphere at the hotel and beyond its wall through the whole of the country was gloomy. The international community continues to contemplate if what had happened was an act of genocide. Paul again meets with General Bizimungu. The general says to Paul that although he has been abandoned by his white friends, he shouldn't worry as he would take care of him. Paul takes the opportunity to request security personnel from the general. He declines but concedes after Paul promises that the Belgians will bountifully reward anyone who helps protect Belgian property. Paul also tricks the general into thinking the Americans would watch every act being perpetrated in Rwanda through their spies and satellites. Paul sees Gregoire flirting around with some ladies, and he turns to the general telling him he admires his ability to keep command of his men amidst the catastrophes. He then refers to Gregoire, saying he has no will to work or listen to anyone. The general was shocked that Gregoire was a staff. He gets up in anger, splashes a bucket of water all over him, shouting he should get back to work. The next morning, Paul tells Gregoire to prepare the van. They both drive to meet George to get food and supplies for the hotel. When they arrive, Paul notices several Tutsi women captured, stripped naked, and molested. Paul tells George he needs supplies, and George explains that everything is double the price now. George also says to Paul that the rich cockroaches at his hotel have no good for their money, because soon every Tutsi would be dead. Paul asks George if he honestly believes they would kill them all. And with a straight face, George says to him, "Why not? We are halfway there already." Before Paul leaves, George tells him that they have been instructed by the Hutu generals not to go near the hotel, but soon those generals would be gone. And then they would be in charge. George says it'll soon be time to butcher the fat cows he keeps for their meat. George advises them to take the river road back to the hotel. While they drive through the midst of the fog, barely seeing anything, the vehicle begins marching over several obstacles. Paul seems to think they have driven off the road and he tells Gregoire to stop the car. He opens the door, and as he tries stepping down, he stumbles and falls over a pile of corpses. Rattled, he steps back. Barely finding any ground to step on, he moves further and was startled by what he was seeing. The bodies of men, women, and children all laying lifeless for several miles on the road. He enters the car, tells Gregoire to drive back, and warns him not to say a word to anyone about what he's seen that day. Paul remains shaking when he is at the hotel and he tears up uncontrollably. Later, a few children dance choreographically to their favorite jingles, and Paul narrates to Dubé what he had witnessed earlier. Later that night, Paul takes his wife to the roof where he had prepared a private banquet for the both of them. Tatiana appreciates the gesture. Paul confessed to her that when they had first met, and she was a nurse in a different city, he bribed the Minister of Health to have her transferred to Kigali, so they could be closer. She asked what the bribe was, and he tells her a car. They both laughed at this hilarious event from their past. They are drawn back by the sounds of gunshots coming from different corners of the city. Then Paul tells Tatiana that they must have a plan, and their children cannot see them die first in this situation. He tells her that should something happen to him, she must take the children to the top of the roof, and they must jump, as getting hit by a matchet is no way to die. She wonders why he was saying all of this and couldn't concede to these thoughts. Later, Colonel Oliver arrives at the hotel, telling Paul that he has good news. He announces to the crowd at the hotel that for some, the calls they made abroad have yielded some results. He calls out the names of the families who were going to be evacuated abroad. Pat drops off the medical supplies she had brought to the hotel. Paul requests her to help him return to the old lady and bring the girls to the hotel. Pat tells him that she can't go back as that part of town has been destroyed in the fighting, and the girls are probably dead now. He pleads with her further, and she tells him she'll try. The next morning the families to be evacuated are arranged to be transported by the UN. Paul, who was supposed to leave alongside his family, decides to stay back at the last minute. Gregoire sneaks out of the hotel to give information about the Tutsis being evacuated to Hutu thugs. The news of the Tutsis being evacuated by the UN soon spreads across the radio. Paul immediately contacts General Bizimungu, demanding his assistance. The trucks are ambushed on the road by hundreds of Hutu extremists demanding to search the truck and get rid of any cockroaches. The UN soldiers, who are greatly outnumbered, did their best in providing cover for those in the trucks, and soon the army arrive at the scene. They begin shooting in the air, dispersing the crowd. The trucks escape, and they head back to the hotel. When they get back to the hotel, Tatiana is very mad at Paul for deciding on his own to leave her, and the kids to stay back at the hotel. At night, Paul sights two men outside the hotel, and they fire rocket bombs at the hotel. There is panic, and everyone rushes to take cover. Paul tries to find out if there were any casualties, and luckily enough no one appeared to be seriously hurt as they had only successfully aimed at the storeroom. The next day, the pool at the hotel was getting dried up. It was the only source of water for those at the hotel since the water had been cut off earlier. Colonel Oliver tells Paul and some residents at the hotel that the RPF rebels have control of half the city. They proposed a deal with the Hutu generals to release all Hutu prisoners. The Tutsis, still in parts controlled by the Hutus, could move behind the rebels' lines. The residents worry about what might happen if they are caught by rogue Hutu military groups, since they do not answer to the Hutu army. Paul believes they have to take the risk since it has become dangerous at the hotel also. At night, Paul remembers having supplies left over at the Diplomat Hotel where he previously worked. The next day he is escorted by General Bizimungu there. After he had given the general his supplies, the general tells Paul he wishes to do him a favor and take him along to their new headquarters. Paul tells the general he does not wish to go and just wants to go back to the hotel. The general points out that the crazed men are on their way to the hotel and that he can't go back now. He pleads with the general to help him get back and save his family. The general asks Paul why. It would be of his interest to help him. Paul lashes out that the Americans have him on their list as a war criminal. The general responds that is tired of Paul's deceit. Paul, in anger, tells the general that he is the highest-ranking army personnel, and he must be stupid to think that he won't be blamed for the catastrophe taking place in the city. After a little brawl, Paul is finally able to convince the general that he needs him to convince the international community that he wasn't responsible for the massacres. When they arrived, the hotel had already been ravaged by Hutu thugs, bringing residents out ready to be slaughtered. The army begins driving out the thugs, and Paul searches for his wife and children. Finally, he found them hiding with some of his neighbors in the bathroom jacuzzi. The UN comes back and helps evacuate everyone at the hotel. On the way, the UN convoy is slowed down by tens of thousands of Rwandans migrating on foot, supposedly Tutsis trying to find a safe haven and escape disaster. Behind the crowd of migrants were Hutus shooting at them and burning the homes which they've left behind. Colonel Oliver orders his men not to stop. While the Hutu keep marching, they are met with fire and fury from the Tutsis rebels emerging out of the bushes. They run, retreating and looking for cover. Luckily, the UN convoy crosses through the rebel lines and they arrive at a refugee camp where they would later be extradited from the country. While they get on the bus, Pat sees Tatiana's nieces. She rushes to stop the bus, informing them that the girls are at the camp. Tatiana is overjoyed at the reunion, and the movie ends here. I hope you enjoyed it. To watch more of these kinds of movies, click on the videos on your screen, and don't forget to let me know how you feel about today's video in the comments down below.